The second type of plagiarism we'll discuss is passage and phrase plagiarism. And this is kind of similar to verbatim plagiarism, but instead of taking the entire sentence, instead what we're doing is we're just taking smaller phrases or chunks. That's where this idea of passage and phrase comes from. So let's take a look in the middle here, right? We've got the original passage from the article that the student wrote, and then we've got what the student wrote at the bottom. So if we see this passage and we compare the two, we could see the part that is reddened, italicized, and underlined is exactly the same between the two. So that student that wrote that sentence at the bottom in their paper, that chunk of words from prevalence of all the way down to suicide ideation is exactly the same as what's in the original article. Even though it's not the full sentence that the student is copying, it's just that phrase, it's just that chunk of words, you still have to put quotation marks around it to indicate that those words are not your own. You did not write those words, right? That student did not write those words. They came from another source, the original article. A good rule of thumb when we're talking about passage and phrase is if it's 3 or more words in a row that you're borrowing, you probably want to put quotes around it. Now, if it's a proper noun like United States of America or the name of a procedure like cognitive behavioral therapy, you don't need to put quotes around that because that's the name of something. But we see here prevalence of depressive symptoms and suicide ideation. It's exactly the same. And as we just talked about on the previous slide, we can borrow these phrases if we want to, but we've got to put quotation marks around the words that we're borrowing, and then we've got to put information in parentheses to show the source that we're getting that from, right? And we're going to practice that near the end of this video, how to not passage and phrase plagiarize, how to not verbatim plagiarize. Now, another form of verbatim plagiarism that we sometimes see is a form of plagiarism that we can call also passage and phrase, but more of a splicing variety. And this splicing variety is where we take an original sentence. So let's examine what's in the original article, right? We've got this part here from the original article, and we can see how these include Ritalin. They're giving the names of a bunch of different medications, talking about autism and those kinds of things. And if we look at what the student wrote, right, what are they doing? They're taking a chunk here, a chunk here, and then a chunk here that is exactly the same as what was in the original article. I sometimes call this Frankensteining sentences, right? Because you're taking a piece from this, a piece from this, a piece from this. If we look at that sentence that the student wrote at the bottom of the page, right? The only original words that they wrote were other drugs and the patients, right? Everything else that is reddened, italicized, and underlined is exactly the same phrasing as the original sentence. So again, even if we're not using the whole entire sentence word for word, we're just using these chunks and phrases, we still need to give proper credit to the original author, right? We've got to put quotation marks around words that are not our own, and then we have to give some information in parentheses to indicate that this is our source that we got the information from.